Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is going to be the third episode in the series titled A Journey into Self-Destruction. Today is going to be all about nihilism. Very fun. Very interesting time to be doing this. Lots of life changes on my end and during the holidays, so let's see how this goes. We're first going to define nihilism and talk a little bit about why it's an important notion in the human condition. Nihilism, like many quote-unquote bad or negative experiences, gets a bad rap, where I believe it to be quite essential, but like all things essential, it depends on how we encounter it. And spoiler alert, given that this entire series is about self-destruction, I don't think we're grappling with it very well. Then we'll go into what I believe is to be kind of like, it's a silly way to put it, but subtypes, or the fancier way of saying it is different ways and how people are encountering the nihilism. Because I think it's so widespread, you get a vast array of how people are confronting nihilism. I'll speak briefly to so what do we do, or what might be some productive space to be in. I mean, spoiler alert, if you're listening or watching this, I would encourage you to be curious about what category you might fall into. I think that in of itself is an important exercise. So first, let's define nihilism. In its simplest form is this notion, this philosophical notion that at the end of the day, the human condition is fundamentally meaningless. That there you cannot know anything in this world, and that these notions that every human life, that our morals, our values have some greater purpose, or they are a greater organizing hierarchy or philosophy that we can apply ourselves to and find meaning and drive and purpose and a brighter future, is BS. It's false. Nothing can be known at the end of the day. It is all so endlessly relative that there is no fundamental point. The sort of experiential example that's often used is like you wake up every morning, you consume a bunch of resources, you expel waste, you go to sleep, and you wake up the very next day and you repeat it all over again. And all these relationships and jobs or volunteers or things that we do in the day-to-day, they are us deluding ourselves into finding some sort of meaning despite the greater reality that everything is meaningless. Now, my joke, borrowing a little bit from my wife who studied philosophy and other folks who I've met who study philosophy, to me the joke, but I think in many ways a beautiful metaphor for life, is that the end of studying philosophy, what awaits you is nihilism. Now, maybe some people are super hipster and they try to embrace nihilism first, but I think when you study human thought and what gives us meaning and purpose and how we organize ourselves as human beings, when you have all of these relative theories and each one holds its own kernel of truth, it is natural to arrive upon at the end of this road a questioning that maybe it all doesn't matter. It's all so relative. It's all just ourselves deluding ourselves into philosophical theories to force meaning onto a life that is fundamentally meaningless. And when I say that there's kind of a beautiful metaphor for that, you look at the human condition, that when we grapple with really challenging things in our life, we begin to question what we know, that it becomes so relative. We're like, what's the greater point? I thought we were going there. I thought I could achieve that. I thought I wanted, I hoped. But life doesn't work that way. And nihilism is waiting for us. This is particularly true in the day and age of information where, growing up, I didn't know what was going on in any other country unless I happened to turn on the world news, and I sure as heck wasn't reading a newspaper as a kid. I had no clue. And so while I was grappling with the notions of meaninglessness and nothingness as an 8-year-old, because I was freaking depressed for, the benefits of depression, which we'll get into a subtype, I was not inundated with constant information about what the world is doing and what all of humanity is trying to grapple with. And indeed, through the lens of the media, but still we have so many sources of information and misinformation. How is it that we could not grapple with nihilism as humanity? That even if we were not actively in what I would posit to be a lurch towards self-destruction, nihilism would still be waiting for us. It's right there waiting for us, and it's actually an important task. if we believe that all forces have a yin and a yang, ancient philosophy that I think has always held true, that within meaning, to understand meaning, there's this sort of absolute meaning, but there also has to be meaninglessness. That's how we arrive upon something that is healthy in the in-between. We cannot delude ourselves into believing that everything holds some sort of meaning, because there's a lot that does not. Even within these greater lurches in society, there are all sorts of people on the fringe that if I could magically delete them, they might not matter as much. Arbitrary, right? And that's not like a power thing. There are people in this world that don't contribute as much as somebody else, and that's just reality. And we don't know, right? The communal whole, the butterfly effect maybe still holds some degree of truth, but we cannot find meaning in everything. But just as well, perhaps we can't reduce the world to pure meaninglessness either. And so we are trying to grapple towards the middle and say, well, both are true. But we cannot confront this without confronting nihilism, especially because the world does not teach us. I've never met a single person in my life that has been taught proactively on how to deal with nihilism. I have not. The closest we get to are the sort of fields of thought that we apply ourselves to. Religion grapples with nihilism in a way. Science grapples with nihilism in a way. And so we do indirectly. But the challenge when we do things indirectly, and we're not explicit with what we are trying to teach, what happens when a mass portion of the populace suddenly confronts the thing that they don't know how to confront? And that's the state that we're in. Welcome to a world filled with nihilism, an experience that you probably were not taught how to grapple with. Welcome to the world of nihilism. So, I hope that's heard, that this is an important existential quandary for us as human beings, particularly as we advance and are constantly inundated with all this information. We cannot avoid it. You look at adolescence and youth these days, like youth, sound like an old guy, the youth, they're constantly grappling with this stuff, constantly. Again, I thought I was like cool as a little 8-year-old contemplating meaninglessness. Like I was just ahead of my time because now everybody has to grapple with it all the freaking time. So we got to start having these conversations and say, like, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? Which leads me to the possible quote-unquote subtypes or how we deal with it. Now, I'm going to try to divide these out. Try to think about this, and it's a little bit complicated. There are the people who kind of embrace nihilism and kind of succumb to it, and then there are those who grapple against it, and each one has its own kind of subtype. So we're going to do the ones that are grappling with it, and then we'll do the ones that are just kind of like succumbing to it. And there's 4 total. Again, there's probably more, but just to give people a general roadmap. And again, try to apply yourself and/or people in your life. And also remember to ask other people around you where they think you are. That's assuming you're not in an echo chamber. So, number 1, grappling. First, we're going to go through, I think, the healthiest one, and I was alluding to earlier, and that's folks who, frankly, are depressed and anxious to some degree. I don't mean you have to be clinically diagnosed, but if you are depressed or sad or dysphoric, and there is any existential flair to it, that there is sadness and dysphoria related to a greater question of one's own meaning and purpose, and or an anxiety, kind of a dread and a tension around greater meaning and purpose in the future, then you're probably grappling with nihilism to some degree. Depression is particularly friends with nihilism because it says, I don't matter, there's something worthless about me, and an incapability to enact change on this world, so much so that I've lost interest and I've lost energy. And indeed, there's all these theories that maybe it's just biology and there's nothing existential about it, and perhaps there are those that are very much more biologically driven, but I can tell you at least half the population that deals with depression is existentially inclined as well. And so it is basically saying, if we were to distill it, just kind of funnel all depression and the existentialism down into a narrow point, it was like, what is the point? What is the greater meaning? Is there any actual meaning? And this is particularly salient when people are contemplating suicide. What is the greater meaning and purpose? a very important dilemma. In the anxiety side, there is this sort of like, I need it to be right. I need to find the answer. And so I'm going to be anxiously preoccupied and worried because I want the safety and control and of some sort of absolute, something to grab hold of to know that there is a greater meaning and purpose. And I hate the fact that I can't figure this stuff out. And frequently the two kind of go hand in hand. You'll have maybe a little bit more of one than the other, but in my experience, it's pretty common to have at least a little bit of both. Even if you lean one particular way. Now, what I find most interesting and why I say it's most healthy to be in this state is the fact that you are feeling depressive energies or the fact that you are having anxious energies suggests that you are not happy and you're not content to simply embrace nihilism and succumb to it. There is a fight. I say this to folks very frequently, especially in the depression realm, but anxiety as well, is like these emotions serve a purpose. We cannot dismiss them as unhealthy medical conditions that we need to get rid of. Sorry, there was air quotes if you're listening to this. Quote unquote medical conditions that we must eradicate ourselves from. We are sick. We are mentally ill. It's like, au contraire, they are serving some sort of purpose. They just tend to overextend themselves. But isn't that an interesting way to grapple with nihilism, is to be distraught by the idea of succumbing to nihilism? There is something incredibly self-preserving within that. And I think it's very important for people to hear that, because by the end of the episode, you'll hear me say, like, if you're feeling depressed and anxious right now, good. That means there's still a fight in you. Now, the other act of grappling, and you notice there's a lot of emotion focus to that. The other end of the spectrum, depression, absolute depression, anxiety can be very detrimental. I mean, yes, it's self-preserving, but there's also a helplessness and a sort of freezing effect or a franticness that can occur around it. Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum is hyper-intellectualism as a means of defending. So it's not a rejection of nihilism. It's just like, well, I'm not going to be fazed by this because I'm going to disallow the depressive and anxious energies and instead just be like, I'm going to be hyper intellectual. And this is what I call false or faux stoicism. These are I find them very annoying. I understand where they come from. I think I had an air of this when I was younger. Maybe not an air of it, maybe a major portion of it, but it's just a softer version because I was a kid, maybe. But these are the folks that are like, I'm going to embrace intellectualism at all costs. I will not listen to these false emotions. Emotions lead me astray. They are weak. I can use my higher cortical functions, the thing that we have evolved into, to rise above these mere mortal issues and make choices that even if things are relatively potentially meaningless, well, I will just make the best choices that I know how today. And I will find and derive some sort of meaning or, blah, 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 blah. It just, again, hyper-intellectual. And the reason why it's false stoicism, for those of you unfamiliar with stoicism is not hyper-intellectualism. Stoicism is actually healthy stoicism is an embracing of both emotion and intellect. And a sort of an objectivity around both. That, like, I have all of this information and I will not allow myself to be so derailed by it. I will instead say, of course I am feeling something, of course I am thinking something, and of course I cannot know everything or feel everything, and so I will try to be objective, and my favorite word, actually curious about what's going on, and apply myself diligently and just make the best choice I can off of that, and then the next issue will present itself, and then I make the next best choice I can. That is what a healthy version of stoicism is. It's a hard thing to embrace because emotions are very rattling, and intellectualism is a very convenient escape. To grapple with both, to find the gray between the two and take action in it is actually a very challenging course of action. As I say action too many times. But these false stoics, they are just endless intellectualism. I will reason my way out of it, which represents, again, a healthy aspect of self, but an overextension. So the people actively grappling with nihilism, the ones that really are stuck in it, tend to fall into one of those two camps because they are an overextension of emotion and or an overextension of intellect, and health lies probably somewhere between those two. The fact that they recognize the nihilistic pools the questions around meaninglessness is incredibly important because they're still in potentially workable spaces, unlike number 2, category 2, which is those who are succumbing and are in many ways enslaved by nihilism. And once again, 2 types underneath it. The first might make some people chuckle, but it is a dangerous one. And those are the people who just kind of flit about in the world, just tending to their day-to-day needs without any real greater care for the greater existential quandaries in the world. They basically say, well, the world's a really, and they don't always consciously say this or believe this, the world is a very complicated place. I'm not sure what to do with it all. Any notions of nihilism are quite scary to me, so I'm just going to go do me. I'm going to get the coffee in the morning. I'm going to scroll, my social media endlessly. I'll do whatever works in front of me, but I'm not going to extend myself much beyond that. And then I have this sort of fleeting moment of existential despair and dread at night, and I'm not sure what to do with that, but I'm just going to go to sleep, and I wake up the next day, I'm going to do the same darn thing over and over again. Now, this might sound vapid, but there's other things we can falsely apply ourselves to. I'm just going to get the good grades today. I'm going to get the gold star at school. I'm going to get some praise from my boss for doing, whatever it is that I need to do. But at the end of the day, there is this sort of nihilistic indifference to anything that requires too much effort. And these are folks that are just kind of phased out of existence. Oh, the greater world is really complicated. I'm not sure what the future is. I'm just not going to pay attention to that. Oh, the politics are going kind of really awry right now, and it's really complicated, and everybody's saying that their position's right. It's not going to deal with that right now. Oh, I could apply myself at work, but it feels like nobody's really getting anywhere in this life, and we could die at the end of the day anyway. I could be hit by a bus tomorrow. Well, I'm just going to show up and do what I need to do. Or, well, maybe I'll apply myself a little bit more there, but then I go home and I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I just kind of show up and I look around on my phone and I eat some food, and the food's good for that moment, but then it's just kind of nothing again, and then I go about the same thing every day. It's just a little dopamine hit after dopamine hit, but there's no grander scope. There's no grander arc to the story. It's just day to day, week to week. Sure, a little goal here, a little goal there. But all of a sudden, weeks have passed by, months have passed by, years have passed by. What's the point? What have I been doing? What have I been applying myself to? I don't know. Nihilism. Nihilism is lurking there. These are folks that, again, are often unconscious of the nihilism, but there's no greater meaning. And they don't seek it out. And so they just succumb to it. They just drift in the sea, wherever the waves take them. A shark eats you. Oh well. Out in the middle of the ocean in a big storm. Well, what are you going to do? I drifted up on this deserted island. There's no food. Huh. That's interesting. It's like that. What's that SNL character? I forget. He's like, okay. And I get it, right? Like, I totally get it. Escapism is a thing. We all need it. We cannot constantly, to the earlier point, you cannot constantly be flooded by all this information and survive. You've got to check out sometimes. But there are swaths of people, particularly the younger generation, just lost in this sea, adrift in the sea of nihilism, and they don't even realize it. Or when they realize it, they just don't grapple with it. They go, nope, not going to deal with it. Until suddenly there's a crisis, until suddenly they kill themselves, until suddenly they find themselves 30 and questioning what all have they been doing. By the way, I've talked about suicide just, since I'm a psychologist, say, please reach out for help, right? There are people like me out there wanting to talk to you about this stuff, grapple with this stuff. Reach out for help. So that's a dangerous one, though, because they're abstaining from anything of greater meaning. They're not contributing to the lurch. They're passively contributing to self-destruction by their inaction, by their indifference. The advancement of any society, even self-destruction, is at least something. It's just just adrift. Incredibly dangerous people. When I go back to the original, my goodness, self-destructive episode, they're the abstainers, forever abstaining. Not because they need rest, Because they just don't care. They cannot bring themselves to care. Because it's too dangerous. It's too scary. It's too amorphous. It's too much work. Now, the last one is the most dangerous. I mean, they at least are taking action. But they are particularly overtly responsible for periods of self-destruction because they take this meaninglessness, which, again, they are often unconscious of. They're not aware that they're struggling with meaninglessness and nihilism. And they say, you know what? That means, is kind of a super abridged version, there's no consequences. That means I can do what I want. The earliest manifestations of this that I think were widespread was actually on the internet, because the internet in the early days was just freaking Wild West, and as it still is to a certain degree today, fully anonymous. And when all of a sudden people enter into the online world and nothing technically matters, it's all relative. There's no greater cost to anything. You just create whatever you want and then you leave it. Then what did some people do? They not in a way of fantasy, embraced a part of themselves that they could not express in the real world. They manipulated other people. They became who other people wanted to be to see if they could mess with people. And this is the growing ideology around trolling people. And there are always people just being asses on the internet. But then it became kind of this thing of like, well, I'm just going to get reactions out of people. I'm going to ruin this person's day. I'm going to screw with this person. I'm going to say the things that I cannot say in the real world. But here's the kicker, is that's not what's going on. That is what's going on. That's not exclusively online anymore. That's happening in the real world now. All these alleged morals and values and safeguards, nihilism is entered in like, that doesn't matter. Common sense of morals doesn't matter. Common sense of truth don't matter. Values doesn't really matter. And when that enters the fray, these people are waiting right there for it and say, now I get to do what I want. I get to say what I want. I get to act how I want. You tell me that's the right thing to do. You tell me that's the healthy thing to do. I'm going to do the exact opposite of that. And, what psychologically is going on for these folks, and they would hate, if you're listening to this, of like, well, maybe I fall into that camp. One, you probably wouldn't recognize it. And two, you're going to hate what I say because you're going to like, that's false. Too bad I'm correct. Well, one, you've got the one is like there are people who are just less empathetically activated. Like at a biological level, they just don't experience that as much, and they are going to capitalize on anything, anywhere, right? You embrace relativity, you embrace this sort of meaninglessness. They're going to capitalize on that because they're all about themselves anyway. But a vast majority of people in this stance are dealing with nihilism and the fear that comes from it through control, by enacting control on the world around them. That when you are aggressive, when you take something and you have the power to disrupt it and screw with it, is a sense of empowerment and thereby control, and that guards against notions of meaninglessness. This is like childhood 101, only with lots of adults now. Like what happens when a kid feels like they're out of control? They either succumb to things, one of the earlier points, or they act out because it gives them control. Momentary control doesn't contribute to anything except control in that moment, and in fact is usually destructive to something. But as a kid, that's an important area of exploration. As an adult, probably should have done that a little bit sooner. In the original episode, these are the intentional net cutters. Not like I'm going to cut it because I want to rebuild something better. Oh, is this holding something up? I don't give a shit. It's just, I'm going to cut it. I do not care. I've got a whole other episodes on this sort of stuff, but these are, again, there's something self-preserving about it. So again, like all of these subtypes, there are kernels of truth to them, but in excess are quite dangerous, because it's just like, I'm going to do the things that are the worst thing that you could possibly do because that gives me power. And so they just actively destroy because they cannot grapple with nihilism, because they cannot manage that themselves. They have to act out on the world. when I talk to folks in leadership about these, in groups or anything like that, about these two types, these are the abstainers and the disruptors, and both hold purposes, but in excess, they will destroy groups. The abstainers get the pass often because they're not so dangerous, overtly bad, but they are destructive in their own right. Not as overtly, immediately destructive, not as caustic in how they destroy things, but they ensure that things are not upheld through their inaction, whereas the other actively tries to deconstruct the things they destroy. Both incredibly dangerous, both, at the end of the day, succumbing to nihilism. They are not grappling with it. They have succumbed. So, those are the 4 overall types, in my opinion. Hyper-intellectualizers, that kind of overtly depressed and anxious, and health existing likely between those two. And then you've got the abstainers, escapists, escape artists perhaps, of the world. And then you've got the active destroyers, the petulant children of the world. And somewhere in between there probably is potential health of, you apply intellect and you apply emotion. You give yourself permission for some escapism, and you do not dismiss anger and sometimes a little bit of just, screw that, I'm upset, because you got to expel those affects. And all of those combined create a healthier human being. You cannot ignore these impulses because we all have them inside of us. It is about a balance between these forces. And so how do I kind of bring this all together at the end? 26 minutes already. Nobody watches more than 6 minutes, so I really got to hurry here. At the end, I think that's it. It's like, where do you find yourself? You might not know this yourself either. You got to enlist the help of others, particularly those who will not engage in groupthink with you or your own echo chamber of, oh, no, you go, you're great, you're super tuned in, and then they're just right there with you being nihilistic. Where are you at, and how do you give permission for that, but look for those counterbalancing forces? I don't have much sage advice beyond that, though, because society, to my earlier point, doesn't really give us spaces for this. And I think that's why I'm making this episode is at least naming it and talking about it gives space for it. It doesn't necessarily give a solution, but at least full circle gives a little bit of intellectual and maybe emotional latitude to encounter this dilemma. But hell if I know. When I think about how do you steer a society through this at large, oh my gosh, you really need figureheads who kind of naturally ingrain this and how they encounter issues and conflict in the world, and we do not have that right now. Not here in America, and there's numerous other countries that do not have that right now. So color me perplexed on how to truly move through it. I guess what I'm trying to say is, let us at least grapple with it. I would implore the world to not succumb to it. Yes, this feels right in this moment. As I ad-lib this thing, this feels right. That is my greater request. That is the best thing that we can do in this day and age, is to be careful of fully succumbing to it. Can we succumb to it a little bit? Of course, we need to. We need to embrace it in some sort of way, and sometimes we're going to want to phase out, and other times we're going to want to throw a rock at a glass house. That's cool. But as long as we're not living there, and that we return to the point of struggle, that is probably the most workable space and probably the best thing that we can do to waylay and kind of push back against our self-destructive tendencies, to not embrace self-destruction so fully and richly, because nihilism is one of the stepping stones to self-destruction. There we go. That sounds like a good endpoint. All right, well, as always, I appreciate folks listening and watching. I hope it's been another interesting episode in this fun little journey into self-destruction I posit we as humanity are currently doing. And we'll see if I come up with another episode. But in the meantime, thanks again, and stay curious. Oh, didn't stop recording. There we go.